Chapter 1. Alexander's Childhood and Origin. Alexander the Great, one of the most dazzling names in world history, was born in 356 BC in Pella, the capital of the Macedonian kingdom. His father was King Philip II, a skillful statesman and general who had turned Macedonia from an insignificant marginal power into a dominant force in Greece. His mother was Olympias, a woman of passionate temperament, whose descent from the old royal house of Epirus increased Alexander's prestige. The combination of these two personalities alone was to shape the young prince, as he grew up in an atmosphere that was equally characterized by power, ambition, intrigue, and exaggerated expectations. Legends about his birth grew up early on. It is said that on the day of his birth, the temple of Artemis in Ephesus burned, an omen that was understood by many as a sign that a man had been born who was to shake the world. Olympias himself nourished the belief that Alexander was of divine descent. She told her that Zeus had come to her in the form of a serpent to beget him, and she instilled in her son the idea that he was of divine origin. Whether Alexander believed it literally or not, the idea of being special stayed with him throughout his life. Alexander's childhood was both sheltered and hard. At the court in Pella, he received the training of a prince that went far beyond what ordinary children of his time experienced. He learned to read and write, occupied himself with poetry, music, and philosophy. He was fascinated early on by Homer, whose Iliad he later always carried with him on his campaigns. Achilles, the hero of the epic, became his model, and Alexander strove to perform deeds on a par with those of the mythical hero. His father, Philip, was a man of great energy, who laid the foundation for Alexander's later conquests with military reforms and diplomatic skills. But he was also strict and made high demands of his son. Alexander had to learn horsemanship, weapon use, and physical discipline as a child. A famous episode tells how the boy tamed the unruly horse Bucephalus, which no one else was able to tame. Philip, impressed by this deed, is said to have exclaimed, "My son, find a kingdom worthy of you, for Macedonia is too small for you." This sentence, whether true or not, became a symbol of Alexander's fate. His teacher Aristotle also had a decisive influence on the young prince. The philosopher from Stagira, one of the greatest thinkers of antiquity, was brought to Pella by Philip to impart education to his son. Under his guidance, Alexander learned philosophy, ethics, politics, natural sciences, and medicine. Aristotle not only imparted knowledge to him, but also an attitude towards the world. He taught him a love of Greek culture and literature, but also a belief in the superiority of the Greeks over the so-called barbarians. This idea was to shape Alexander's later self-image as a conqueror. But the relationship between father and son was not free of tensions. Philip was an outstanding ruler, but also a man full of passions, who took different wives and often humiliated Olympias. Alexander felt close to his mother, which led to conflicts with his father. When Philip entered into a new marriage with Cleopatra Eurydice, thus creating the possibility of further legitimate heirs to the throne, Alexander felt threatened. There was an open dispute between father and son, which went so far that Alexander went into exile in Illyria for a time. Only later did he return after mediation, but the relationship remained strained. Despite these family tensions, Alexander proved his skills at a young age. At the age of 16, Philip gave him the regency while he himself was on military campaigns. Alexander took the opportunity to consolidate his authority. He put down an uprising of the Thracian tribes, founded a city, and named it after himself. This was a foretaste of the role he would soon take on. Alexander's youth was thus marked by great expectations, strict training, and early probation. He grew up in a kingdom that had been strengthened militarily and politically by his father's reforms. At the same time, he lived in a world marked by the memories of the glorious past. of the victories against Persia, of the heroes of Homer, of the philosophers who thought about the order of the cosmos. All of this merged in Alexander into a consciousness that he was destined for greater things. When Philip was murdered in 336, Alexander succeeded him at a young age. He was just 20 years old, but he already had the education, experience, and determination that would enable him to create an empire in a few years. But before he could devote himself to this goal, he first had to secure his power within, a chapter that his rise to legend would open. Chapter 2. The Assumption of Power and the Securing of the Throne. When Philip II was murdered in 336 BC at the wedding of his daughter Cleopatra, unrest immediately broke out in Macedonia. In the eyes of many, the conspiracy that led to his death was the work of court intrigue, personal revenge, and political calculation at the same time. For 20-year-old Alexander, the moment was decisive. Suddenly, he was at the head of an empire that was strengthened by his father's victories, but at the same time threatened by envy, rivals, and external dangers. Only if he succeeded in securing power at home and asserting his authority over the Greek city-states and his own nobles could he hope to continue his father's work. The change of throne was by no means a matter of course. Philip had left numerous enemies in his own empire, and not a few saw in Alexander's youth a sign of weakness. Macedonian aristocratic society was full of ambitious men who sensed their own opportunities. In addition, Philip's new marriage to Cleopatra Eurydice had raised questions about the succession to the throne. If this union had produced a son, Alexander's claim could have been contested. After Philip's death, there was therefore a great danger that opposing parties would try to overthrow the young prince. Alexander reacted with determination. Even before the rumors of the murder had completely subsided, he had potential rivals eliminated. Cleopatra Eurydice and her child were murdered, as was Attalos, a powerful relative who had influence at court. Other nobles who were considered a possible threat also fell victim to Alexander's harsh actions. This harshness may seem cruel, but it was necessary in the political culture of Macedonia. Only those who eliminated their opponents could assert themselves on the throne. After securing himself inside, Alexander had to win the loyalty of the army. The Macedonian phalanx formed by Philip was the backbone of the empire. Alexander was familiar to them. Through his youth, he had trained with them and fought with them on smaller campaigns. Now he presented himself as the rightful heir, the one who would complete his father's work. The soldiers accepted him, recognizing in him the same energy and military talent that they had appreciated in Philip. But the danger did not only come from Macedonia. As soon as Philip was dead, the old opponents stirred in Greece. Athens, Thebes, and other city-states, which had only reluctantly submitted under Macedonian hegemony, saw the chance to free themselves. They considered Alexander's youth to be weakness and prepared for an uprising. Thebes in particular was determined to throw off the Macedonian yoke. Alexander knew he had to act now. Hesitation would have brought down the entire Macedonian system. He marched south with his army with incredible speed. At a time when most rulers deliberated for days before making a decision, Alexander surprised with speed and determination. He suddenly stood before the walls of Thebes before the city could count on the full support of Athens. The siege ended in disaster for Thebes. Alexander had the city destroyed in 335, its walls torn down, and the population sold into slavery. Only the houses of the poets and the temples were spared. This brutality was not a whim, but a political message. All of Greece should realize that Alexander's authority could not be questioned. Athens and the other cities took the warning seriously and surrendered without risking an open confrontation. Alexander had prevailed. His victory over Thebes secured him not only the rule of Greece, but also the respect of the Macedonian army and the nobles. No one could claim that he was too young or too weak to lead the empire. He had shown that he was as determined and fearless as his father, if not more. The Greeks were intimidated, Macedonia was firmly behind him, and Alexander could begin to tackle the great plans that Philip had left behind, the war against the Persian Empire. But before he could turn his gaze to the east, he had to keep order in the north. Thracians, Illyrians, and other tribes who had lived on the Macedonian border for centuries took advantage of the change of power to revolt. Alexander led several campaigns into the impassable area, crushed the insurgents with severity, and restored Macedonian supremacy. In doing so, he demonstrated not only military skill, but courage, often fighting on the front line. These campaigns secured the northern borders and cemented his reputation as an intrepid general. Intimidated with Greece and secured the northern borders, Alexander could now turn to the great visions. The plan to attack Persia was not new. Philip had already prepared the campaign to unite the Greek city-states in a joint enterprise. Now Alexander took over this goal. But what might have started as a large-scale raid for Philip was to become an unprecedented conquest that changed the world order. When he crossed the Hellespont with his troops in 334, he was no longer the young, uncertain heir to the throne, but a consolidated king who had secured his power within and whose name was already feared throughout Greece. He had withstood the first trials, eliminated his enemies, crushed uprisings, and united the empire. Now began the adventure that was to make him one of the greatest figures in world history. Chapter 3. The beginning of the Persian campaign, the transition to Asia. In 334 BC, Alexander began his great campaign against the Persian Empire, the vast empire that stretched from the coasts of Asia Minor to the Indus. Since the days of the Persian Wars, the relationship between Greece and Persia had been marked by enmity, and Alexander knew how to portray his war as a continuation of this conflict. He not only wanted to take revenge for the destruction of Athens by Xerxes, but also to act as the liberator of the Greek cities of Asia Minor, which had long been under Persian rule. But behind this propaganda was a much greater claim. Alexander strove for nothing less than the conquest of the known world. The beginning of the campaign was carefully prepared. Philip II had already made preparations, but after his death, Alexander had to rearrange everything. Now he had a force of about 30,000 infantrymen and 5,000 cavalry, a relatively small army compared to the resources of the Persian Empire, but highly disciplined, experienced in combat, and shaped by years of reforms according to Philip's ideas into the most powerful weapon in the world at that time. In particular, the Macedonian phalanx, equipped with the long sarissa, formed the backbone, while the cavalry, including the elite of the Hetairs, was to be the decisive weapon in Alexander's hands. The transition to Asia was also a symbolic act. Alexander himself was aware of the historical dimension. When he crossed the Hellespont, he is said to have stopped and offered sacrifices at the place where the legendary Achilles had once rested. In Ilios, he honored the tomb of the hero whom he had admired since his youth. He wanted to join the tradition of the great warriors, and he staged his campaign not only as a military undertaking, but as a continuation of the epic struggle between Greeks and Persians, which already played a role in Homer's poetry. The first encounter with the Persians took place on the river Granicos in Asia Minor. Here he was opposed by Persian satraps with a strong army, which consisted mainly of cavalry. Alexander did not hesitate, despite the misgivings of his generals, to attack immediately. He himself led the storm across the river, a risky maneuver that almost cost him his life. In fierce battle, he rushed with his Hetair cavalry on the Persian lines, while the Macedonian phalanx in the center increased the pressure. Eventually, the Persians collapsed, and Alexander won his first major victory on Asian soil. The consequences of the victory at the Granicos were far-reaching. Many Greek cities in Asia Minor opened their gates to him, greeted him as a liberator, and handed over garrisons of the Persians. Alexander used this opportunity to present himself as a defender of Greek freedom, even though in reality his rule was often only secured by the stationing of Macedonian troops. Nevertheless, he managed to win the sympathy of many Greeks and consolidate his image as a charismatic leader. His further expedition through Asia Minor showed the versatility of his character. On the one hand, he was merciless towards cities that resisted. On the other hand, he showed generosity towards those who surrendered. He restored the democratic constitutions, but also had Macedonian governors installed. This mixture of political calculation and military toughness was to become a trademark of his rule. Of particular note was the conquest of Halicarnassus, a heavily fortified city defended by the Persians under the famous general Memnon of Rhodes. The siege was long and hard, but Memnon was eventually forced to surrender. With this victory, Alexander had gained control of large parts of the coast of Asia Minor and created a secure base from which he could move further east. But it was already clear that the campaign was not only a war against an external power, but also a struggle for Alexander's self-image. He began to see himself not only as a Macedonian king and leader of the Greeks, but as a ruler who pursued a greater mission. He dreamed of conquering Asia, founding new cities, and creating a world shaped by his rule. While the Persians regrouped and King Darius III himself was to take the lead, Alexander was determined to advance further. The victory at the Granicos was only the beginning. In the years to come, he would fight battles that would go down in history, conquer cities that were considered impregnable, and indelibly engrave his name in the memory of mankind. The transition to Asia was the first step on a path that would make him the greatest conqueror of his time.
Chapter 4. The Battle of Issos and the Encounter with Darius. After Alexander had gained a foothold in Asia Minor and defeated the Persians at Granicos, he moved further south, always haunted by the thought that the real target was not the individual satraps, but King Darius himself. The Persian great king had meanwhile realized that the Macedonian campaign was not an ordinary invasion that could be repelled with local troops, but an existential threat to his empire. So he gathered a huge army in Babylon and Susa, which was far outnumbered by the Macedonian army. But before the decisive encounter came, Alexander marched through the coastal cities of Asia Minor and Syria, where he consolidated his power and deprived the Persians of their seaports. The path finally led him to Cilicia, where he passed through the narrow Cilician Gate into the area of today's southern Anatolia. There he suffered a moment of weakness when he became seriously ill, perhaps from a fever attack after a bath in the cold river Kydnos. His soldiers were already afraid of losing their leader, but Alexander recovered surprisingly quickly. This episode even strengthened his authority, for it showed that even in illness his will was unbroken, and that he was willing to entrust his life to the doctor who treated him, even though rumors of betrayal were circulating. While Alexander was in Cilicia, Darius marched into Syria with his mighty army. Originally, he wanted to place Alexander in the wide plain near Sachi, where the numerical superiority of the Persian cavalry and infantry would have come into its own. But due to a misunderstanding or Alexander's unexpected movements, things turned out differently. Darius succeeded in cutting off Alexander's supply routes, and so the two armies met in the narrow coastal strip near the city of Issos. The Battle of Issos in 333 BC became a turning point. Alexander, with perhaps 40,000 men, faced a Persian force that is said to have been twice as large. But the narrow space on the coast neutralized the numerical superiority of the Persians. Alexander placed his phalanx in the center, while he himself wanted to lead the decisive attack with the Hetero cavalry on the right wing. Darius was in the center of his army, surrounded by his royal guard. When the battle began, the Persian cavalry attacked fiercely on the left wing and harassed the Macedonian troops. But at the decisive moment, Alexander personally led the attack of his cavalry wing, broke through the Persian line, and advanced directly towards the center. The force of his attack panicked Darius. Sensing the terror of the moment, the great king abandoned his chariot and fled, causing his entire army to falter. The victory was complete. The Persian army dispersed, and Alexander captured the royal camp. In the process, not only immeasurable treasures fell into his hands, but also Darius's family, his mother, his wife, and his daughters. Alexander treated them with respect and refused the temptation to use them as prey. Instead, he granted them royal honors and secured them protection. This behavior, which impressed even his enemies, strengthened his reputation as a magnanimous and superior ruler. Darius's flight had far-reaching consequences. For the first time, the great king had personally backed away from Alexander, and this weakened his authority throughout the empire. Many satraps and cities began to reconsider their loyalties, and some turned to Alexander. At the same time, the Battle of Issos showed that the Macedonian tactics were superior to the Persian masses. With discipline, clever lineup, and determined attack, Alexander had defeated a superior force. For the Greeks and Macedonians, the victory was a triumph that bound them even closer to their king. They now saw in him not only a capable general, but the man who was actually able to conquer mighty Persia. In the cities of Greece, the news was received with enthusiasm, even if some, especially in Sparta, were critical of Alexander's power. Darius tried to end the war through diplomatic offers. He offered Alexander rich tributes, territories west of the Euphrates, and the hand of one of his daughters. But Alexander refused. For him, there was no compromise. He did not want parts of the Persian Empire, but dominion over the whole. He saw himself as the rightful ruler of Asia, and with each victory, his claim grew. The Battle of Issos was therefore more than a military success. It was the moment when Alexander stepped out of his father's shadow and showed himself to be an independent world conqueror. Darius's flight had destroyed the image of the invincible great king, while Alexander shined as a youthful victor and future ruler of Asia. The way was clear to the south, to Syria and Egypt, where further major chapters of his history of conquest were to be written.
Chapter 5. The Journey to Egypt and the Founding of Alexandria. After the victory at Issos, Alexander was faced with a strategic decision. He could have marched directly into the heart of the Persian Empire, but he realized that his flanks were threatened by the Persian fleet. As long as Persia retained control of the coasts of the eastern Mediterranean, Alexander could be cut off from supplies at any time. Therefore, he decided to move south first to conquer the coastal cities of Syria and Phoenicia, and thus wrest from the Persians their bases on the sea. Most of the cities surrendered without resistance. But the Phoenician city of Tyre, famous for its mighty walls and rich history, refused to let Alexander in. Tyre was an island city, separated from the coast by the sea and protected by high walls. Many considered them impregnable. Alexander, however, accepted the challenge. In one of the most spectacular sieges of antiquity, he had a dam built from the mainland to the island so that his siege engines could be brought up to the walls. The work took months, and the Tyrians put up fierce resistance. But finally, the Macedonians stormed the city. Tyre fell in 332 BC, and Alexander made a terrible example. Thousands of inhabitants were killed or enslaved to show all other cities that resistance was futile. After Tyre, Alexander turned to Gaza, which also stubbornly resisted. Here, too, he relied on violence, and after a bloody siege, the city fell. The way to Egypt was now clear. Unlike in Syria and Phoenicia, where Alexander had to fight fiercely, the Egyptians received him as a liberator. They had suffered under Persian rule and saw Alexander as a savior who freed them from foreign rule. When he entered Memphis in 332, he was recognized as pharaoh and received with all honors in the temples of the old gods. In Egypt, there was a different trait in Alexander's character. He knew how to respect the religious feelings of the conquered peoples and to fit into their traditions. He sacrificed to the Egyptian gods, was worshipped as the son of Amun, and presented himself as the legitimate ruler of the country. His visit to the Oracle of Siwa, an oasis in the Libyan desert, was particularly impressive. The way there was arduous, but Alexander insisted on seeking out the deity himself. There, the oracle is said to have confirmed a divine ancestry to him. For Alexander, this was not only a religious experience, but a confirmation of his self-image as the chosen one by the gods. In Egypt, Alexander also resorted to one of his greatest political means, the founding of the city.
He recognized the strategic importance of the Mediterranean coast and decided to build a new city on the western Nile Delta that would bear his name, Alexandria. This city was to become a center of trade, culture, and science and develop into one of the most important places in the ancient world. Even when it was founded, Alexander thought not only of military purposes, but also of creating a lasting legacy. Alexandria later became the seat of the famous library and a symbol of the fusion of Greek and Oriental culture. The stay in Egypt was a phase of consolidation for Alexander. He secured the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, won the sympathy of the population, and presented himself as a ruler rooted in the traditions of the countries he conquered. He was not only a conqueror, but also a politician who knew how to legitimize rule. His appearance in Egypt showed the mixture of toughness and foresight that characterized his career. But Alexander did not stay long in Egypt. His gaze was already directed to the east again. Persia was not defeated, and Darius again gathered a formidable army, this time in Mesopotamia. There, on the wide plains, it was to be decided whether Alexander was just a successful general or the conqueror who could usurp the greatest throne in the world at that time. The path led him over the Euphrates and Tigris to the heartland of the Persian Empire, where one of the greatest battles of antiquity was to be fought. Chapter 6. The Battle of Gaugamela and the Fall of Darius. When Alexander moved east again after his triumphal stay in Egypt, he was aware that the fate of the Persian Empire was about to be decided. Darius III had lost most of his family after the defeat at Issos and had seen his authority severely damaged, but he was by no means defeated. With the enormous resource power of the Persian Empire, he gathered a new army, the size of which contemporary sources describe as hundreds of thousands of men. Although these figures may be exaggerated, it remains undisputed that Darius had a vastly superior force, which was concentrated in the plain of Gaugamela north of Nineveh. There he wanted to bring about the decision. Alexander, on the other hand, led his comparatively small but battle-hardened army of around 40,000 infantrymen and 7,000 horsemen. He was aware of the superiority of his troops, not in numbers, but in discipline, in combat experience, and in confidence in his leadership. For years he had fought at the head of his men. He had won victories that had been considered impossible, and he had created an unwavering loyalty through courage and personal presence. When he addressed his troops on the eve of the battle, he promised them not only victory, but also the end of the Persian kingdom that had ruled Asia for centuries. Darius had prepared himself thoroughly. He had the plain of Gaugamela smooth so that his chariots with sickles on their wheels could unfold their full effect. He placed his troops in a broad front, in the middle the royal guard and his own person, on the wings the mighty cavalry. In addition, there were Indian elephants, a rare but terrifying element that the Macedonians had never seen before. Everything pointed to the fact that Alexander was facing an almost insurmountable superiority. On the morning of October 1, 331 BC, Alexander carefully arranged his army. In the middle stood the Macedonian phalanx, the long spears of the Sarissa in a steel wall. On the left wing was the Thessalian cavalry under Parmenion. On the right wing, Alexander himself led the Hetaian cavalry. He intended to lure the Persians out of their position in order to break through at a crucial point. The battle began with the advance of the Persians. Their chariots were rushing towards the Macedonian front, but Alexander had taken precautions. The phalanx opened its ranks, let the wagons slide through, and closed again immediately. Many chariots were stopped by spears or steered into rough terrain where they became useless. The first shock fizzled out, and the Macedonians still stood firm. Alexander's maneuver on the right wing was decisive. He led his cavalry diagonally outwards so that the Persians were forced to follow suit. This created a gap in the middle of the Persian front, exactly where Darius stood. Alexander recognized the moment and threw himself into this opening with his Hetairs. With all his might, he broke into the center, aimed directly at the great king, and caused panic near him. As with Issos, Darius could not withstand the direct threat. He lost his nerve, left his chariot, and fled the battlefield.
The sight of the fleeing king had a devastating effect on the morale of the Persian troops. Despite their numerical superiority, they began to break apart. Meanwhile, Parmenion held out on the left wing with heavy losses until Alexander returned to support him. Eventually, the battle turned into a bloodbath, with the Persians fleeing in all directions and the Macedonians pursuing them mercilessly. The victory at Gaugamela was complete. Darius had squandered his last chance to defeat Alexander in an open battle. The Persian army practically ceased to exist as an organized force, and the roads to Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis were open. Alexander was now the undisputed ruler of Asia. Darius was still alive, but his authority was destroyed, and many of his own satraps began to turn away from him. After the battle, Alexander entered Babylon, which surrendered without a fight and received him with open gates. Here, his soldiers experienced riches that they had hardly dreamed of before. Soon after, Susa followed, with immeasurable treasures in the royal treasuries, and finally Persepolis, the heart of the Persian Empire. Here, Alexander had a sign set. The magnificent palaces, symbol of the power of the Achaemenids, were plundered and set on fire. Whether this was a deliberate political signal or an uncontrolled act in the intoxication of victory remains controversial. But the image of the burning palaces became a symbol of the downfall of the Persian Empire. Darius fled to the east, but he was a king without an army, a ruler without an empire. He spent his last days on the run, while Alexander pursued him, determined to capture the great king. But before he could reach him, Darius fell at the hands of his own satraps, who murdered him in order to secure Alexander's favor. When Alexander found the body, he reverently covered it with his own cloak and had the fallen enemy buried royally. With this act of piety, he presented himself not only as the victor, but also as a worthy successor to the Persian kings. The Battle of Gaugamela was thus not only a military decision, but the moment in which Alexander actually became master of the largest empire in the world at that time. He had defeated the great king, he had the treasuries of Persia in his hands, and he had the power to reshape history. But for him, this was not the end, but only the beginning. His gaze now turned further east, beyond the boundaries that any ruler had crossed so far.
Chapter 7. The Journey to Persepolis and the End of the Achaemenids. After the mighty decisive battle at Gaugamela in 331 BC, the core of the Persian Empire lay open before Alexander. Darius III had fled, his authority destroyed, and the great metropolises of Babylon and Susa readily opened their gates to Alexander. In Babylon, he was received with splendor and reverence, as if he were already the rightful ruler. The city, rich in culture, religion, and trade, placed itself under his rule without resistance, and Alexander proved generous by respecting religious traditions and honoring the temples. This picture was also repeated in Susa, the old royal city. Alexander not only took over the riches of the Persian treasuries, but also placed himself in the tradition of the Achaemenids by acting as their successor. But Alexander's gaze was fixed on Persepolis, the heart and symbol of the Persian royal power. Persepolis was not just a city, but a monument to the dynasty that had ruled Asia for centuries. Here stood the palaces of the great kings. Here lay the treasures that Darius I and Xerxes had collected from the conquests. For Alexander, Persepolis was the ultimate destination, the place where he wanted to make visible the final victory over the Persians. The way there was arduous. Alexander led his army through the wintry highlands, over snow-covered mountain paths, where hunger and cold demanded the men as well as the hostile tribes that opposed him. In particular, the passage through the so-called Persian Gates, a narrow gorge in the Zagros Mountains, became a test. Here, Persian defenders had taken a strong position and initially inflicted heavy losses on the Macedonians. But Alexander found a detour, led a detachment over the mountains, and stabbed the defenders in the back. The position was broken, and the road to Persepolis was clear. When Alexander entered Persepolis in the spring of 330 BC, he stood in the place that stood for the power and pride of the Achaemenids more than any other. The city was plundered, and the immeasurable treasures fell into the hands of the Macedonians. It is said that thousands of beasts of burden were needed to carry away the gold and silver bars that had been collected over generations. For his soldiers, this was an unimaginable wealth, a reward for their loyalty and deprivation. But the most significant event was the fate of the royal palaces. In one night, the exact circumstances of which are still disputed today, the palace of Xerxes was set on fire. Some sources report that it was Alexander's own order, an act of revenge for the destruction of Athens during the Persian Wars. Others say it happened in the intoxication of a feast, incited by the hetera Tyus, who seduced Alexander to set the palaces on fire. Whatever the trigger, the fire sprayed quickly and turned the magnificent halls into a landscape of ruins. This act had a tremendous symbolic effect. The palaces, which embodied the power of the Achaemenids, went up in flames, and with them the rule of the old dynasty visibly ended. For the Greeks, it was a triumphant act of retaliation. For many Persians, a shock that sealed the end of their world order. Alexander himself is said to have later repented of the destruction, because he understood that he was not only the conqueror, but also the ruler of this empire. But the damage had been done, and the image of the burning palaces of Persepolis became a symbol of the fall of the Persian Empire. While Alexander was in Persepolis, Darius fled further east. He was still alive, but he had lost all real power. Some satraps remained loyal to him. Others were already beginning to turn to Alexander. For Alexander, however, it was crucial not to simply let Darius flee. As long as the great king lived, he could be a symbol of resistance. Therefore, Alexander soon set out to pursue him. The months in Persepolis marked a turning point. For the first time since the beginning of his campaign, Alexander was no longer just the leader of a Macedonian army of conquest, but the ruler of a world empire that extended far beyond Greece. The question arose as to how he wanted to shape this empire, as a foreign ruler who ruled by force, or as a successor who took over the traditions. In Persepolis, both were evident. The destruction of the palaces as a sign of annihilation, but also the seizure of the treasures and the recognition of Persian dignitaries as the beginning of a new order. With the fall of Persepolis, the power of the Achaemenids was broken. Darius was a king without an empire, and Alexander openly appeared as his successor. The young Macedonian king, who had once been ridiculed as the 20-year-old heir to the throne, now stood at the head of an empire that was larger than anything the Greeks had known before. But his ambition went further. For Alexander, the victory over Persia was not the end, but only the middle of his path. Behind the eastern mountains, new lands, new peoples, and new challenges awaited. And Darius was not dead yet, nor did the shadow of the old kingdom live on.
Chapter 8. The Persecution of Darius and the Transition to Central Asia. After the sacking and destruction of Persepolis, the Persian Empire seemed to have been defeated for good. Alexander had conquered Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis, emptied the treasuries, and set fire to the symbols of Achaemenid rule. Nevertheless, the war was not over as long as Darius III was still alive. For Alexander, it was crucial to either capture or kill the great king, because as long as he was free, he remained a standard-bearer for possible uprisings and a threat to the final consolidation of power. With this conviction, Alexander began the persecution that was to lead him further and further east, far beyond the borders that a Greek or Macedonian had ever crossed. Darius had retreated to the east after the defeat at Gaugamela, accompanied by the remnants of his followers and some satraps who still stood by his side. But his reputation was severely shaken, and many began to reconsider their loyalty. Among them was the powerful satrap Bessos of Bactria, who ruled over the rich eastern provinces and was soon to play a key role. Darius' flight became a symbol of his decline, the king of a vast empire moving from province to province, chased on and on by a young conqueror who would not rest until he had reached his goal. Alexander left Persepolis in the summer of 330 and passed through Ecbatana, the capital of Media, where he again got his hands on enormous riches. Here he left part of his army behind to secure the conquered territories, while he himself took up the pursuit with a more mobile corps. The hunt for Darius took on almost mythical features. Alexander covered enormous distances in a very short time, crossed mountains and deserts, always on the trail of the fleeing king. For his soldiers, it was a proof of his tireless will; for his opponents, a source of terror. But before Alexander could reach Darius, there was a dramatic turn. Bessos and other Persian nobles had realized that the great king had become a ballast. They feared that Alexander's persecution would drag them to their doom and decided to betray Darius. In an act of betrayal, they captured him and finally murdered him before Alexander could catch up with him. When Alexander found the body, he had it reverently covered and buried in a royal manner. At that moment, he demonstrated not only greatness, but also political wisdom. He presented himself as the legitimate successor of Darius, not only as his conqueror. With Darius' death, the Achaemenid dynasty came to an end. Bessos, who now proclaimed himself the new great king under the name Artaxerxes V, tried to assert his rule over the eastern provinces. But Alexander recognized his chance. He declared Bessos a traitor and murderer of the king, and claimed for himself the claim to rule the entire Persian Empire. This shifted the character of the war. It was no longer a question of defeating Persia, but of crushing a new uprising and securing Alexander's legitimacy. The persecution now led Alexander to regions that were hardly part of the known world. Bactria and Sogdia, areas in present-day Afghanistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, became the theaters of his campaigns. Here, far away from the old centers, he encountered new peoples, new landscapes, and a kind of war that was fundamentally different from previous battles. Instead of open battles against large armies, the focus was now on guerrilla tactics, ambushes, and endless marches through inhospitable terrain. This was a tough test for the Macedonians. Many wondered why Alexander was not satisfied. Hadn't he already conquered the world's greatest empire, won the riches of Babylon and Persepolis, and defeated the Persians? But Alexander was driven by an insatiable ambition that pulled him further and further east. He not only wanted to take up the legacy of Darius, but also to conquer new lands, found new cities, and engrave his name indelibly in history. The death of Darius also meant a new role for Alexander. He began to present himself more as the ruler of Asia, not just as a Macedonian king. He adopted Persian court ceremonies, demanded proskynesis from his followers, the kneeling tribute, and adopted Persian robes and titles. Many of his Macedonian companions reacted with unease, some with open rejection. But Alexander understood that he ruled an empire far larger than Macedonia or Greece, and that he had to integrate the traditions of the Persians into his rule if he wanted to succeed in the long term. The persecution of Darius and the transition to Central Asia marked a new phase in Alexander's conquest. The war was no longer just revenge for the Persian wars or a campaign to liberate the Greek cities, but an unstoppable advance into a world that had previously been foreign to the Greeks. With each step, Alexander became less of a Greek king and more of a world monarch who transcended cultural boundaries. But this also marked the beginning of tensions within his army. Many of his officers felt alienated, no longer saw him as a simple comrade who fought side by side with him, but a ruler who distanced himself from them. These tensions were to lead to open conflicts again and again in the years to come.
Chapter 9. The Campaigns in Bactria and Sogdia, War at the Edge of the World. With the death of Darius and the proclamation of Bessos as the new great king, Alexander did not reach his goal, but was faced with a new challenge. The power struggles in the east of the empire opened up the possibility for him to consolidate his claim as the rightful ruler of Asia, but the path led to regions that had hardly been imaginable for the Macedonians.
Bactria and Sogdia, far from the fertile plains of Mesopotamia, offered barren land, steep mountains, and peoples accustomed to the harsh climate and the constant threat of war. For Alexander, this move was not only a military undertaking, but also a step into a new world in which he had to learn to fight and rule differently. Bessos, the satrap of Bactria, had declared himself king after the murder of Darius, but his power was fragile. Many nobles and tribes regarded him with suspicion, as he was considered a traitor to Darius. Alexander cleverly took advantage of this by publicly branding Bessos as an assassin and declaring that he would avenge Darius' death as his successor. In doing so, he did not present himself as a foreign conqueror, but as a rightful heir who wanted to restore order in the empire. This political calculation was decisive in winning supporters among the Persian elites. The campaign to Bactria began with long marches over rough terrain. The Macedonian army had to fight its way through mountains and deserts, constantly threatened by attacks from local tribes who used guerrilla tactics and retreated into the inaccessible countryside as soon as they got into trouble. For Alexander's soldiers, who were used to open field battles, this was an entirely new kind of war. Instead of quick decisions, there were endless marches, small skirmishes, and the constant danger of ambushes. Alexander himself showed his unwavering energy in this phase. He often led his men personally, braved the heat and cold, and shared the deprivations of his soldiers. In doing so, he maintained their loyalty even if the hardships wore many down. Again and again he promised them that new riches and new honors were waiting behind the mountains. His ambition was insatiable, and he transferred this urge to his followers. Finally, Alexander succeeded in confronting Bessos in Bactria. But instead of facing an open battle, he fled on to Sogdia, to even more remote regions. His own companions began to doubt his leadership, and when Alexander pursued him, Bessos was captured by his own people and handed over to Alexander. The young king staged his punishment with great care. Bessos was scourged, mutilated, and finally executed, a clear sign that treason was not tolerated and that Alexander, as the rightful king, also determined the fate of the Persian nobles. But the war was not over with Bessos' death. Sogdia, the land of high mountains and fertile oases, rose up against Macedonian rule. Again and again uprisings broke out, led by local princes and warriors who did not want to submit. Spitamenes, a Sogdian nobleman, was particularly stubborn, who repeatedly attacked Alexander's garrisons with fast cavalry troops, attacked cities, and repeatedly retreated inland before the Macedonian army could confront him. The battles against Spitamenes became years of attrition. Alexander had to leave garrisons in the cities to secure the conquered territory, while he himself hunted down the rebels with mobile units. In the process, he learned that military toughness alone was not enough. He began to form political alliances, involve local princes in his administration, and promote marriages between his officers and local women. During this time, his idea of creating an empire that was not only supported by Macedonians and Greeks, but in which the conquered peoples also had a place, became clearer for the first time. However, the harshness of the war was also reflected in Alexander's measures. Cities that rose up were cruelly punished, and uprisings were crushed with all their might. A famous example was the conquest of the Sogdian fortress at the rock castle of Sogdiana, which was considered impregnable. Alexander had volunteers climb the steep rocks with hooks and ropes, and when they hoisted the Macedonian banner over the fortress, the defenders surrendered in fear. This victory cemented Alexander's reputation as an indomitable general who made even the impossible possible. Sogdia also marked a turning point in Alexander's personal life. There he met Roxanne, the daughter of a local prince, whom he took as his wife. This marriage was not only an expression of personal affection, but also a political signal. Alexander deliberately allied himself with the local elite in order to legitimize his rule. For many of his Macedonian companions, however, this was another step in a direction they viewed with suspicion. Alexander seemed to be becoming more and more a ruler of Asia, not just a king of Macedonia. The campaigns in Bactria and Sogdia showed that Alexander's ambition knew no bounds. Even in the remotest corners of the former Persian Empire, he got his way. But the price was high. Years of fighting, demoralized soldiers, growing tensions between Alexander and his officers. As he pressed further and further east, many wondered if his quest for glory and conquest had any goal at all, or if he was driven by a restlessness that could never be quenched.
Chapter 10. The March to India and the Battle of Hydaspes. After years of fighting in Bactria and Sogdia, Alexander had taken control of most of the former Persian Empire. But his ambition knew no bounds, and the young king's gaze turned further east. The reports about the land beyond the Indus, of mighty rivers, exotic peoples, and huge cities aroused his curiosity. For Alexander, it was not enough to rule Persia. He wanted to reach the end of the known world, conquer new empires, and imprint his name on history. The march to India began in 327 BC over the impassable highlands of Gadrotia. Alexander led his army through unimaginably difficult areas: mountains, rivers, dense forests, and endless steppes. The soldiers suffered from hunger, thirst, heat, and cold. Many expected the campaign to come to an end. But Alexander kept her in line. He himself marched on the front line, sharing water and supplies, supervising every step, and inspiring his men by his own example. His courage, energy, and iron will preserved the unity of the troops. Arriving at the Indus, they faced an opponent who was completely new to the Macedonians. The kings of the Indian tribes had raised their troops in a formation that was very different from the Persian armies. They used war elephants, massive animals that could cause panic in the ranks of the Macedonians, and had fast cavalry units that made clever use of the open field. The physical size and unfamiliar tactics of the Indians presented Alexander with a new challenge, and he had to adapt his strategy. The decisive battle took place on the Hydaspes, a river in Punjab that formed the natural border between the known lands and the unknown east. Alexander crossed the river at night and in difficult conditions to surprise the opponent. His surprise attack threw the Indian army into confusion. The phalanx formed the center, while Alexander and his cavalry led a decisive thrust against the enemy's flanks. The war elephants, impressive and terrifying, were isolated by targeted action and partly surrounded by the Macedonians. The battle was hard and costly. Alexander's troops had to fight against the massive thrust forces of the elephants, which threatened to tear apart the ranks of the infantry. But through precise coordination, the use of his own mobility, and Alexander's unwavering courage, it was possible to defeat the Indian army. King Poros, who led the resistance, was captured. Despite his victory, Alexander showed unusual generosity. He treated Poros with respect, let him keep his troops, and installed him as ruler of his own empire. This approach not only consolidated his authority, but also showed that Alexander understood that conquest alone was not enough. The involvement of the local elites was crucial for lasting rule. The Battle of Hydaspes earned Alexander the respect and admiration of his soldiers, who had experienced elephants and a completely new form of war for the first time. It was also a testament to Alexander's tactical genius, for he had faced an opponent who seemed physically superior and yet defeated him. The capture of Punjab and the subjugation of Poros meant that Alexander had for the first time reached the borders of the then-known world. But despite the victory, the first doubts began to germinate in the army. The men had decades of campaigns behind them, had endured endless marches through deserts and mountains, fought countless battles, and had now arrived beyond the Indus. The tropics, the unknown rivers, and the foreign peoples afflicted them just as much as the constant expectation that Alexander would penetrate even further east. At Opis, as the army marched further towards the Ganges, the first open protests broke out. Many soldiers refused to go any further. Alexander had to realize that even the most loyal followers had reached their breaking point. The Battle of Hydaspes thus marked the highest military and geographic goal of Alexander's conquests. He had brought the Indus region under control, integrated Poros into his system, and cemented his reputation as an invincible general. At the same time, it was clear that his power was not infinitely sustainable.
The exhaustion of the army, the distance from home, and the logistical challenges set limits even for Alexander. With the subjugation of the Indus Valley, Alexander began to prepare for the retreat, although he still dreamed of further expeditions. For him, the border of the Ganges became a symbolic end to the conquest, a point at which even the greatest conqueror had to acknowledge that his troops had done their duty. Nevertheless, Alexander remained present in the region, founding cities, strengthening its administration, and planning the integration of the local population before finally preparing for the long return march that would take him to Persia and finally to Babylon.
Chapter 11. The Return from India and the Consolidation of the Empire. After the Battle of Hydaspes and the subjugation of Poros's empire, Alexander was faced with the difficult task of consolidating his vast empire and maintaining his power over regions far removed from his Macedonian homeland. The years in India had shown that even its most loyal soldiers were reaching their limits. The physical exhaustion, the endless marches through deserts and mountains, the unaccustomed heat, and the constant fighting had pushed the army to the limits of its capacity. At Opis and along the Ganges, there was open resistance for the first time when its veterans refused to advance further east. Alexander had to realize that he had achieved the goals of his campaign. The largest empire in the known world was under his control, and the conquest of territories further east was almost impossible to cope with militarily and logistically. However, the return to the west was by no means an easy return march. Alexander led his army over the difficult way back through the deserts of Gedrosia, a route even more cruel than the march to the east. The sun burned mercilessly, water and supplies were scarce, and many men died of exhaustion or starvation. Despite these hardships, Alexander kept his army together by fighting on the front line himself, demanding discipline and rewarding every success. He understood that morale was just as crucial as tactics, and he used his authority to preserve the unity of the troops. During the retreat, Alexander also began to consolidate his system of rule. He realized that military power alone was not enough to govern an empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus. Therefore, he increasingly focused on political integration by involving Persian nobles in his administration, leaving local rulers in their positions and arranging marriage alliances. Particularly striking was his own marriage to Roxanne, the daughter of a Bactrian prince. This connection not only had personal significance, but also served to legitimize his rule in the eastern provinces. He also arranged weddings between his officers and local women in order to promote cultural integration and bind his soldiers more closely to the conquered regions. Alexander also took advantage of this phase of consolidation to found new cities that would serve as military bases and cultural centers. Alexandria on the Indus was just one example. Other cities were built along the main roads, along rivers, and at strategic crossroads. These settlements served not only military purposes, but also the dissemination of Greek culture and the enforcement of its political order. They were intended to permanently secure its presence in the remote areas and strengthen the connection between the core of Macedonia and the far-flung provinces. During the consolidation, Alexander's self-image as a ruler grew. He was no longer only king of Macedon or general of Greece. He saw himself as the ruler of the entire Eastern Empire, as the successor of the Achaemenidans, and as the legitimate king of Asia. This was also reflected in his self-presentation. He adopted Persian court ceremonies, had the court officials perform proskynesis, the kneeling tribute to them, and wore Persian robes. These measures, controversial as they were among his Macedonian officers, showed Alexander's understanding of the need to rule a multi-ethnic empire not only militarily but also culturally. Despite his successes, tension within the army grew. Many veterans who had been marching and fighting in extreme conditions for years saw Alexander's increasingly far-reaching plans as an overstretching of their forces. Some officers who had once stood loyally by his side began to criticize, and there were first signs of discontent.
Alexander knew that he had to secure his authority not only through military victories, but also through personal presence, rewards, and recognition. In the provinces themselves, Alexander relied on a mixture of toughness and diplomacy. Cities that resisted were severely punished, while those that voluntarily submitted were rewarded. This policy strengthened loyalty, but at the same time showed the clear hierarchy that Alexander wanted to enforce as ruler. At the same time, he began to reorganize the administration. Taxes were collected more systematically, garrisons were stationed, and local elites were involved in governance. With his return from India and the consolidation of the empire, Alexander had not only secured the geographical boundaries of his empire, but also laid the political foundation to stabilize his power in the long term. He had shown that he was able not only to achieve military conquests, but also to organize the complex structures of a world empire. But despite all these achievements, his gaze was still directed to the east. The borders of the known world were not the end for him, but only a new challenge. His ambitions knew no rest, and the years after his return would show that Alexander was willing to overcome any difficulty in order to realize his vision of an invincible rule.
Chapter 12. The Revolts of the Local Princes and Alexander's Rule in the Provinces. After returning from India, Alexander the Great was no longer just a general, but a ruler of an empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus. But the conquest alone did not guarantee permanent control. In the far-flung provinces, local princes began to question Macedonian supremacy. In Bactria, Sogdia, Persis, and other areas that had previously been under Persian rule, uprisings were organized that threatened the stability of the empire. Alexander had to learn that military victories were only one side of rule, and that political intelligence, diplomatic talent, and cultural sensitivity were just as crucial to securing the loyalty of the subjugated. One of the most stubborn opponents was Spitamenes, a Sogdian nobleman who united the local tribes after the murder of Bessos and repeatedly attacked Alexander's garrisons. His tactics were unorthodox: fast cavalry troops, ambushes, and the exploitation of the mountainous landscape. Alexander had to reorganize his troops, deploy them flexibly, and even penetrate dangerous fronts to break the uprising. Many of his Macedonian officers criticized this approach because it was much more dangerous than open battles. But Alexander once again showed his ability to think strategically and take personal risks. The uprisings forced Alexander to use a combination of violence and diplomacy. In Sogdia and Bactria, he led both military punitive expeditions and negotiations with influential tribes. He recognized that the integration of local elites was crucial to securing long-term peace. He combined war with marriage alliances, forged bonds through gifts, recognition of traditions, and the adoption of local administrative practices. This policy had two effects. It weakened the resistance of the population and secured the loyalty of the local princes. At the same time, it showed Alexander's ability to bridge cultural differences and orient his rule towards long-term stability. A key event was the incorporation of Bactria. After the region was exhausted by continuous uprisings, Alexander relied on Bessos's former follower as a mediator. At the same time, he carried out targeted military actions that crushed any resistance. The population realized that Alexander's power was unstoppable and began to recognize his authority. He implemented similar measures in Sogdia. Cities such as Maracanda and Alexandria Eshate were strengthened. Garrisons were stationed, local leaders were involved, and trade routes were secured. Another instrument was Alexander's policy of Hellenization. By founding new cities bearing his name and promoting Greek culture and education, he conveyed a common identity to the subjugated. These cities became centers of administration, trade, and military power.
They enabled Alexander to maintain control over the vast empire, even in remote regions, while creating cultural ties between the Macedonian occupiers and the local population. But this policy was not without controversy. Many Macedonian veterans, who had fought side by side with Alexander for years, were critical of the increasing integration of the Persians, Bactrians, and Sogdians. They feared that their own position and identity would be undermined, and there were repeated tensions within the army. Alexander had to demonstrate his authority again and again, through personal presence, rewards, but also through toughness when disobedience threatened. However, the uprisings in the provinces also had a positive side. They forced Alexander to develop a differentiated system of rule. He learned that brute force alone does not bring stability, but that political intelligence, cultural sensitivity, and integration are the keys to governing a multi-ethnic empire. This realization shaped the last years of his campaign, in which he became not only a conqueror, but also a statesman. In the end, Alexander managed to break the uprisings and stabilize the provinces. Even in the remote regions such as Sogdia and Bactria, Macedonian garrisons were established, cities were founded, and local princes were involved. Through these measures, he not only secured dominion over the conquered territories, but also laid the foundation for the later administration of his empire. The rule in the provinces showed that Alexander's genius lay not only in battle, but also in politics. He understood that control over an empire required more than military superiority. The combination of violence, diplomacy, cultural integration, and the ability to win personal loyalty made him a ruler whose empire remained stable despite its vast expansion. With the suppression of the uprisings and the consolidation of his rule in Central Asia, Alexander began to turn west again, on the long march back through Persia toward Babylon. But the challenges were not over, and his army, exhausted by years of uninterrupted campaigning, was about to face the next test.
Chapter 13. Alexander's March Back to Persia and Babylon. After years of incessant campaigns in India, Bactria, and Sogdia, Alexander the Great began the march back to Persia in 325 BC. The march was anything but a triumphal procession. The army was exhausted from the long marches, the fierce fighting, and the tropical heat of India. Many soldiers suffered from disease, hunger, and the rigors of the extreme conditions. Nevertheless, Alexander managed to keep his troops together by marching on the front line himself, sharing risks and constantly reminding his soldiers that they were fighting not only for riches, but for the glory and permanence of an empire that was unparalleled in world history. The return march led over the inhospitable highlands of Gedrosia, an area characterized by heat, drought, and a lack of water sources. Supplying the army was an enormous challenge. Alexander had his men rationed, water sources secured, and search parties marched ahead to explore paths through the mountains. Many soldiers died on this march, but the perseverance and discipline that Alexander himself exemplified held the remnants of the army together. In this phase, he demonstrated not only military talent, but also organizational skills, because the logistical planning of a return march through such hostile terrain was almost as important as the fight itself. On the way back through Sogdia and Bactria, Alexander again encountered local uprisings. Despite the previous subjugation, some tribes had not yet fully accustomed themselves to Macedonian rule. Alexander once again combined toughness with diplomatic skill. Cities that resisted were vigorously punished, while princes who submitted were reinstated in their sovereign rights and integrated into the Macedonian system. This strategy strengthened his authority and secured the loyalty of the provinces, while at the same time promoting the integration of the conquered peoples. When crossing rivers and mountains, Alexander once again showed his tactical brilliance. He used the geographical conditions to control the movements of enemy groups and at the same time protect his own army from attacks. With every challenge, be it rivers with raging currents, narrow mountain passes, or sneaky raids, he found a solution that motivated his soldiers and intimidated the enemy. This combination of personal presence, tactical genius, and logistical planning was an integral part of his success. At last, Alexander reached the central Persian plains again. He moved to the cities he had previously conquered, such as Persepolis and Susa, to reorganize the administration and consolidate his power. In Persepolis, he had the remains of the palaces secured and the administration reorganized to ensure control over the heartland of Persia. In Susa, he met the successors of the Persian nobles, whom Alexander skillfully integrated into his system of rule. Through these measures, he created a stable administrative basis for his extensive empire, which stretched from Greece to the Indus. Babylon, the historic capital of Mesopotamia, was the next destination. The city was considered a symbol of the power and splendor of Persia, and Alexander was aware of its political importance. His entry into Babylon was both a military and a symbolic event. The city opened its doors and welcomed Alexander as the legitimate ruler. Here he began to reorganize the administration, secure trade routes, collect taxes efficiently, and win the loyalty of the local elite. Babylon became a center of his rule and the base for further operations in the west and east of the empire. During his stay in Babylon, Alexander once again demonstrated his ability to combine military power and political legitimacy. He treated the local leaders with respect, integrated them into the administration, had Greek and Macedonian troops serve alongside local soldiers, and combined Hellenization with respect for local traditions. This balance between toughness and diplomacy made his rule not only effective but also sustainable. The march back to Persia and Babylon was not only a logistical masterpiece for Alexander, but also a period of consolidation in which he consolidated his role as ruler of a multi-ethnic empire. The soldiers who had endured the hardships were now veterans of a historic campaign who owed him absolute loyalty. The provinces were suppressed, the administration reorganized. Alexander had proven that his genius consisted not only on battlefields, but also in the ability to rule a vast empire, found new cities, integrate local elites, and use cultural diversity to stabilize rule. But Alexander did not rest on his laurels. His ambition remained undiminished, and while Babylon initially served as his center, his gaze was already turning again to further expansion, to new territories, to new peoples, and to the vision of an empire that included all the known countries of Asia. The return to Persia was thus not the end, but a strategic turning point from which Alexander planned the last years of his unprecedented campaign.
Chapter 14. Alexander's political reforms and the merging of cultures. After years of military conquest and the march back from India, Alexander the Great faced a new challenge. He had created an empire larger than anything that had been ruled by any man before, but mere military power was not enough to rule it in the long term. From Greece to Macedonia, Persia, Bactria, and Sogdia to the Indus, a multi-ethnic empire stretched in which different cultures, languages, and traditions met. Alexander recognized early on that rule over such an empire required new strategies that went beyond pure warfare. One of Alexander's central measures was the integration of the local elites into the system of rule. Instead of subjugating or destroying them, he sought cooperation. In Persia, he appointed former satraps and nobles to their positions, provided they submitted to him and remained loyal to him. In Bactria and Sogdia, he arranged marriages between his Macedonian officers and local women in order to strengthen political ties and promote cultural fusion. Alexander himself married Roxanne, the daughter of a Bactrian prince, an act that had both strategic and symbolic significance. He connected the Macedonian warrior elite with the local population and created a sense of shared identity. At the same time, Alexander introduced administrative reforms that were intended to make the empire more efficient and stable. He organized the provinces into a clear hierarchy, stationed garrisons in strategic cities, ensured the security of trade routes, and supervised the collection of taxes.
In doing so, he combined Greek administrative traditions with local structures to create a balance between control and acceptance. The reforms were aimed not only to secure the empire militarily, but also to stabilize it economically and politically. Another means of securing his rule was the promotion of Hellenization. Alexander founded cities that bore his name, such as Alexandria in Egypt and Alexandria Eshkate in Sogdia. These cities served as administrative centers, trading bases, and military garrisons. At the same time, they were to spread Greek culture. Language, architecture, education, and lifestyle were to create a common cultural basis. In these cities, Greeks, Macedonians, and locals lived together through an exchange of ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. Alexander understood that this cultural fusion could strengthen loyalty to his rule. Alexander's political vision went even further. He sought not only to control a vast empire, but also to promote the fusion of cultures to create a new world order. He tried to combine Greek and Persian traditions by staging himself as a divine ruler, like the Persian kings, while emphasizing the Greek ideals of honor, courage, and education. Alexander introduced court ceremonies known to the Persians, had proskynesis practiced, and adopted Persian dress and titles. This led to tensions with his Macedonian officers, but Alexander was convinced that the power of his empire depended on a cultural synthesis. In addition to these administrative and cultural measures, Alexander also used military presence as a means of securing power. Strategically placed garrisons, regular inspection trips, and personal presence in the provinces prevented uprisings and showed that his authority was unchallenged. At the same time, he combined this harshness with generosity. Cities that resisted were severely punished, but those that submitted were given autonomy and protection. This balance between severity and reward was central to Alexander's model of rule. Alexander understood that securing a world empire is achieved not only through military strength, but above all through political intelligence and cultural foresight. His reforms aimed to combine power, loyalty, and identity. The empire was more stable than ever before as a result of these measures, and Alexander was able to consolidate his rule in the eastern provinces while cultivating the myth of his invincible person. This phase of his reign was crucial to the long-term impact of his empire. The political reforms and cultural fusion that Alexander initiated laid the foundation for an order that continued to have an effect long after his death. They showed that he was not only an extraordinary general, but also a visionary statesman who understood the challenges of a multi-ethnic empire and found innovative ways to wield dominion over a diverse population. The combination of military genius, administrative efficiency, and cultural foresight made Alexander a ruler whose vision extended far beyond the boundaries of his own time. Through its reforms, the former Macedonian army began to become a multi-ethnic army. Its cities developed into centers of cultural synthesis, and the empire began to embody the idea of a new world order. An order based not only on violence, but also on integration, cooperation, and the fusion of traditions. With these reforms and the consistent integration of the provinces, Alexander was well equipped for the last years of his reign. His vision of a world empire that transcended cultural and geographical boundaries could be pursued, and his name would become immortal not only through his military victories, but also through the cultural and political structures he left behind.
Chapter 15. Alexander's Last Campaigns and Preparations for the West. After the successful consolidation of his vast empire, Alexander the Great turned his attention to new challenges. The eastern provinces were largely pacified, the local rulers were integrated into his system, and the administration was reorganized. But Alexander was restless. His ambition, which had already driven him from Greece to Persia to India, would not rest. He began to think about new campaigns that would now take him to the west. This was a phase in which military conquest, political security, and cultural expansion were increasingly linked. The last few years in the eastern provinces have been marked by continuous marching movements, small military battles, and diplomatic measures. Alexander had to maintain the loyalty of his soldiers, who were exhausted after the exertions of years of campaigns.
Many of his veterans began to long for home, but Alexander understood that his empire was not yet fully stabilized. In this phase, his military skills were challenged as well as his strategic vision. A central problem was the integration of the local armies. While he had previously been able to rely on Macedonian discipline and Greek experience, Alexander now also had to involve the troops of the subjugated peoples. Bactrians, Sogdians, Persians, and Indians were accepted into the army, with Alexander creating new command structures to coordinate different types of troops. This integration was risky, as cultural differences and mistrust within the army created tensions, but Alexander managed to unite the units and shape them into a powerful military instrument. During these years, Alexander continued to persecute the remnants of the Persian dynasty who were resisting in remote provinces. Even though Darius III was dead, local insurgents and self-proclaimed kings appeared trying to regain control of individual regions. Alexander led campaigns in Central Asia, put down uprisings, and established garrisons in strategic cities to prevent future revolts. The projection of power was not only military, but also administrative. It ensured that the cities had sufficient administrative staff, that taxes were levied, and that the local population was integrated into the system. At this stage, Alexander also began to turn his attention to the western regions. Greece and Macedonia were largely stable, but the West offered new opportunities and challenges. Alexander planned to further expand Hellenism, secure trade routes, and consolidate control over important resources in Asia Minor, Thrace, and areas further west. This was not only a military project, but also a political strategy to position his empire as a cultural and economic center. Alexander attached great importance to the fact that his expansion was supported not only by violence, but also by diplomacy and cultural integration. In Asia Minor, Greek cities were strengthened again, local princes were involved, and new trade connections were established. Alexander understood that control over the West could not be achieved by conquest alone, but by creating stable political structures and integrating the local elites into its power structure. At the same time, Alexander planned to make his own successes visible. New cities were founded to consolidate the Macedonian presence in the West and spread Greek culture. These cities served as military bases, trading centers, and cultural bridges between the core of Macedonia and the western provinces. Alexander combined strategic planning with visionary foresight, combining both military security and cultural influence. The last campaigns in the East thus served not only to subjugate insurgents, but also to prepare for new ventures in the West. Alexander built a stable backbone, a loyal, battle-hardened army, administrative structures in the provinces, garrisons at strategic points, and political ties through marriage alliances and integration of local rulers. In doing so, he created the conditions to move westwards again and further consolidate his empire. Despite these successes, Alexander remained restless. His ambition and his idea of an empire that transcended cultural, ethnic, and geographic boundaries drove him further. He was aware that the preservation of his empire depended not only on military power, but also on political wisdom, cultural integration, and the ability to secure loyalty. The last campaigns in Central Asia and India had taught him that dominating an empire required patience, intelligence, and vision, qualities that Alexander wanted to use in the West as well. With these preparations, Alexander was ready to take on new challenges. He focused on regions that had previously been on the fringes of his attention, and he planned to combine both military expansion and political consolidation. The foundations were laid for a new phase of his rule, a stable, multi-ethnic empire that remained under his control despite its enormous expansion, a loyal army that would follow him in all battles, and a political vision aimed at uniting the cultures and peoples of his empire in the long term.
Chapter 16. Alexander's Vision of a United Empire and the Challenge of His Officers' Loyalty.
After years of uninterrupted campaigns and the consolidation of his eastern provinces, Alexander the Great began to shape his empire not only militarily but also politically and culturally. He had conquered an empire that stretched from Greece to the Indus and was now faced with the task of controlling these vast territories in the long term. For Alexander, the empire was more than just a military construct. He dreamed of a world in which peoples of different cultures could be brought together, loyalties could be redefined, and power could be stabilized through integration and fusion. A central part of this vision was the connection between Macedonian, Greek, and indigenous elites. Alexander was convinced that military strength alone would not be enough to secure control. Therefore, he ordered the marriage of his officers to local nobles. He himself married Roxanne, the daughter of a Bactrian prince, and he promoted the integration of Persian, Sogdian, and Bactrian officers into the administration and the military. This approach was not only of strategic importance, but also symbolically served to create a common consciousness in the empire. The idea was clear: loyalty should not come from fear, but from connections and recognition. However, this policy met with resistance. Many of his Macedonian officers, who had fought side by side with Alexander, viewed the integration of the Persians and other peoples with skepticism or disapproval. They saw this as a watering down of Macedonian traditions and feared that their own positions and privileges would be undermined. The tensions between Macedonian loyalty and the need to govern a multi-ethnic empire became increasingly palpable. Alexander had to demonstrate his authority over and over again through personal presence, strategic rewards, occasional toughness, and, above all, through the clear communication of his vision. The fusion of cultures was a central element of his rule. Alexander founded cities that served not only as military garrisons, but also as centers of Greek education and culture. Alexandria on the Indus, Alexandria Eshati in Sogdia, or Alexandria in Egypt became places where Greek language, architecture, and science met local traditions. Alexander wanted to create a cultural unity that would support political stability. The cities were an expression of his idea of an empire that could endure beyond ethnic differences. In addition to cultural measures, Alexander relied on a policy of recognition and integration of local rulers. Satraps who had previously been loyal to the Persian great king were installed under Alexander's sovereignty and integrated into the administration of the empire. At the same time, he retained control of military power by stationing garrisons and distributing a dense network of loyal officers across the provinces. In this way, he succeeded in securing political stability and at the same time increasing the acceptance of the population. This phase of his reign was marked by a balancing act. Alexander had to maintain the loyalty of his Macedonian officers, who were unsettled by the integration of the Persians and natives, but at the same time won the trust of the conquered peoples. He understood that his success was not only based on military victories, but on the ability to combine power, diplomacy, and cultural fusion. Every uprising, rebellion, and protest was used to improve the structures of his empire and to concretize his vision of a united empire. Alexander's approach went far beyond pure conquest. He wanted to create an empire based on loyalty, integration, and cultural connection. This vision made him unique. While earlier conquerors relied on submission through violence and intimidation, Alexander combined military strength with political and cultural strategies. The fusion of peoples, languages, and traditions was to create a new order that could last for generations. But the implementation of this vision was not easy. Alexander was constantly confronted with resistance within his own ranks. Some of his generals doubted the wisdom of integration policy. Others feared a loss of power. Alexander had to act wisely to moderate the tensions while underpinning his authority. Through rewards, appointments, personal care, and occasional harshness, he managed to maintain the loyalty of his officers and soldiers to a large extent. In this phase, Alexander became visible not only as a general, but also as a statesman. He combined military genius with political foresight and cultural sensitivity.
His vision of a unified empire that did not suppress but integrate the diversity of cultures was as ambitious as his earlier military campaigns. Alexander had recognized that lasting domination of a world empire had to be secured not only by victories on the battlefield, but by clever politics, integration, and cultural fusion. The last years of his life would show how far Alexander was willing to implement this vision and what challenges the loyalty of his officers, the stability of his provinces, and the limits of human endurance would pose for him.
Chapter 17. Alexander's return to Babylon and the preparation of new expeditions. After the years of conquest and consolidation of his vast empire, Alexander the Great returned to Babylon, the city that had been a center of power, culture, and administration since the time of the ancient kings of Mesopotamia. For Alexander, Babylon was not only a logistical hub of his empire, but also a symbolic center of his claim to succeed the Achaemenids. Here he wanted to stabilize his empire, introduce new reforms, and lay the foundation for further expansion plans. The return to Babylon was of great strategic importance. Alexander had to reorganize his huge army, which was exhausted after years of uninterrupted campaigns. Many veterans suffered from the strains of the campaigns, diseases, and deprivations had reduced their numbers. Alexander realized that the preservation of his power could not be based solely on military successes. Therefore, he began to reorganize the troops, reinforce garrisons in the provinces, and ensure that the military presence of the empire was felt everywhere. At the same time, he turned his attention to political consolidation. Babylon was to serve as an administrative center from which the administration of the entire empire could be coordinated. Alexander used the experience of the Persian administration and combined it with Macedonian traditions to create an efficient system. He appointed loyal officers in key positions, had the local elites involved in the administration, and made sure that tax revenues were secured and evenly distributed. In doing so, he created the basis for stability in an empire that stretched over thousands of kilometers. The cultural dimension also played a decisive role. Alexander understood that rule had to be legitimized not only militarily and administratively, but also symbolically. He promoted the fusion of Greek and local cultures, had Greek settlements and educational institutions built in Babylon, and integrated local traditions into his system of rule. This policy of cultural integration served to secure the loyalty of the population and to consolidate his power on a broad social basis. Meanwhile, Alexander planned new expeditions. His ambition was unbroken, and the known boundaries of his empire were no limit to him. He thought of exploring the Arabian Peninsula, the southern regions of Persia, and perhaps even the territories beyond the Indus River to further expand the borders of his empire. At the same time, he worked to secure trade routes, establish new cities, and take control of strategically important points that allowed the exchange of goods, information, and cultural influences. The soldiers were exhausted on the one hand, but inspired by Alexander's energy and vision on the other. They saw in him not only a general, but a leader who made the impossible possible. Alexander led them not only through military operations, but also through diplomatic and administrative challenges. He combined military prowess with political skill and cultural sensibility to create an empire that could last beyond immediate successes. During this phase, the growing tension between Alexander and his officers also became apparent. Many veterans who had fought side by side with him were skeptical of his vision of integration and cultural fusion. Some feared that their own traditions and privileges would be undermined, while others saw the rapid pace of expansion as risky. Alexander had to prove his authority time and time again by ensuring loyalty and discipline through both rewards and personal presence. Babylon became a center of this new phase of his rule. The city served not only as a starting point for further military and diplomatic undertakings, but also as a symbol of the fusion of cultures propagated by Alexander.
This is where political decisions were made, armies were reorganized, trade routes were secured, and new cities were planned. Babylon represented the combination of power, culture, and administration, a microcosm of what Alexander wanted for the entire empire. The return to Babylon was thus much more than a mere march from India to Mesopotamia. It marked the transition from a phase of military expansion to a phase of political consolidation and cultural integration. Alexander showed that he was not only a conqueror, but a visionary, statesman, and strategist. His ability to combine military success, political reform, and cultural sensibility made him unique and gave him the opportunity to create an empire that remained stable despite its enormous expansion. But Alexander did not rest on his laurels. The preparation of new expeditions, the planning of further reforms, and the securing of his rule over the widely scattered provinces showed that his ambition remained unmeasurable. Babylon thus became the starting point of the last years of his life, in which Alexander not only proved his military power, but also shaped the legacy of his empire and laid the foundations for the administration and cultural synthesis of a world empire.
Chapter 18. Alexander's health problems, the lifestyle at court, and the first harbingers of his death. After years of uninterrupted campaigns, endless marches, hard fighting, and permanent political and administrative responsibility, Alexander the Great's exhaustion began to make itself felt. Despite his tireless ambition and seemingly limitless will, he too was only human, and the physical consequences of such a lifestyle became increasingly visible. Alexander, who had always spent his life on the front line, among the soldiers and under extreme conditions, increasingly suffered from the hardships that his years as a conqueror entailed. His health began to fluctuate. Historical sources report bouts of fever, insomnia, swelling, and recurrent ailments due to exhaustion, infections, and possibly inadequate nutrition. In addition, there were the injuries he had suffered in numerous battles. Alexander was repeatedly injured in frontline fighting, but he refused to accept the care of the doctors if it could interfere with his appearance at the head of the army or his presence at political ceremonies. This behavior made him a symbol of unwavering strength, but it also accelerated physical decline. His lifestyle at court also contributed to the burden. Alexander was known for extravagant parties, lavish feasts, and night-long consultations with his officers. Historians report drinking bouts in which Alexander endured several days without interruption, which strained not only his body, but also his circulation and physical resistance. In addition, there was the stress caused by political tensions at court. His officers were not always uniformly loyal, rival generals conducted intrigues, and the responsibility for a world empire weighed heavily on him. Every decision could trigger uprisings, jeopardize loyalties, or spark conflicts between provinces. The first harbingers of his death appeared during this time. Alexander often seemed exhausted, reacted irritably to criticism, and showed moments of physical weakness that he otherwise knew how to hide skillfully. At the same time, he was obsessed with advancing his vision of a unified empire. The founding of new cities, the integration of cultures, and the preparation of further campaigns demanded constant presence and tireless attention. Even illnesses could not deter him from his plans. He often allowed himself to be carried to audiences, military inspections, or diplomatic negotiations despite feverish conditions. Alexander's court was a mirror of his personality, magnificent but burdensome, loyal but full of tensions. The soldiers and officers who had accompanied him admired his energy, but at the same time feared the unpredictability of his ambition. Intrigues and power games were the order of the day, and Alexander had to be vigilant not only militarily but also politically at all times. His body began to slowly weaken under this double burden of campaigns and court life. Another factor was the psychological tension. Since his youth, Alexander had the ambition to conquer the world, subjugate the Persian Empire, and unite cultures. This vision was associated with enormous pressure, not only militarily but also ideologically. Every region, every province, every city that opposed him presented a personal challenge.
The constant urge to be at the top, both physically and politically, led to overwork, lack of sleep, and a constant state of tension that further weakened his physical health. Despite these warning signs, Alexander continued to show leadership qualities that left his soldiers and subjects in awe. He conducted personal inspections, negotiated with satraps and nobles, organized new cities, coordinated administration, and planned possible expeditions to the west and south. But the traces of his body became increasingly clear. He seemed paler, more exhausted, and reacted more sensitively to physical complaints. The combination of excessive physical strain, excessive lifestyle at court, repeated battle wounds, stress, and lack of sleep increasingly affected Alexander. Historians speculate that this, along with infections, tropical diseases, or alcohol-related complications, prepared his death. In the years following his return from India, his body began to show the signs of this extreme way of life. The time in Babylon, which was supposed to serve the consolidation of the empire, thus also became a phase in which Alexander encountered his own physical limitations. The indefatigable energy that had carried him to victories from Persia to India could not cancel out natural exhaustion. The harbingers of his death were subtle, but they were recognizable to contemporary observers and his closest officers. This phase of his life marked the end of the inexorable expansion and the beginning of a new, more sensitive challenge, securing a vast empire under conditions that the ruler himself became increasingly exhausted and vulnerable. Alexander now had to secure both his troops, his political structures, and the loyalty of his officers in an empire that was in danger of disintegrating without his leadership, a task far more difficult than any battle on the battlefield.
Chapter 19. Alexander's Death, Questions of Succession and the Legacy of His Empire. In 323 BC, the life of Alexander the Great reached its tragic climax. After years of uninterrupted campaigns, physical exertion, endless marches, and permanent political responsibility, his health deteriorated progressively. Babylon, which he had previously established as the center of his power and administration, now became the place of his death. The exact causes are still the subject of historical debates today. Some sources report a febrile illness, possibly malaria or typhoid. Others suspect the consequences of his numerous injuries and the excessive lifestyle with excessive drinking and lack of sleep. It is also conceivable that a combination of infections, exhaustion, and poisoning played a role. The only thing that is clear is that the man who had changed the world in a few years paid the price of his unwavering ambitions. His death triggered immediate political upheavals. The huge empire, which stretched from Greece to Persia to India, had no clear heir to the throne. Alexander left no adult son, but only the unborn son of Alexander IV and a half-brother, Hydaspes, who was intellectually disabled. The Macedonian generals and officers who had fought alongside him in the army faced the difficult task of preserving the empire, while the leader who had united them for years no longer existed. The question of succession became a central problem that was to determine the fate of the entire empire. Immediately after Alexander's death, a struggle for power began, which became known as the era of the Diadochi. The generals initially divided the empire among themselves provisionally, while at the same time recognizing the legitimacy of Alexander's descendants. Perdiccas, Antipater, Ptolemy, and Seleucus were just a few of the powerful men who tried to secure their own spheres of power. The initial agreement was fragile and only lasted as long as common interests could prevail. Soon, a series of wars and intrigues broke out in which the empire disintegrated into several kingdoms. Despite the political fragmentation, Alexander left behind an unprecedented legacy. His conquests had connected the world like never before. Trade routes were opened, cities were founded, cultural exchange between Greeks, Persians, Indians, and Egyptians was promoted. Alexandria in Egypt, the cities along the Indus River, and the numerous garrison towns in Central Asia became centers of Greek culture, science, and administration. The fusion of Greek and local traditions initiated by Alexander continues to shape the regions long after his death. His military legacy was equally significant. The tactics of the Macedonian phalanx, the use of cavalry, rapid marching movements, and combined deployments of infantry, cavalry, and siege engines set new standards in the art of war. Centuries later, generals from Hannibal to Caesar to Napoleon studied Alexander's battles to learn from his strategies. He showed that a single charismatic leader was able to defeat even numerically superior opponents through discipline, courage, and organizational talent. His legacy was also lasting on a political and cultural level. Alexander had conveyed the idea that a world empire could be secured not only by military power, but by the integration of different peoples, by cultural fusion, and by diplomatic skill. His founding of cities, the promotion of trade and education, and the integration of local elites laid the foundation for an administrative and cultural structure that lived on in the successor empires after his death. Ptolemy in Egypt, Seleucus in Mesopotamia, and Bactria and Antigonus in Asia Minor continued Alexander's ideas even if they could not preserve political unity. His death also had a symbolic effect. The man who had expanded the boundaries of the known world and redefined notions of power, war, and domination was no more. But his myth lived on people's minds. He was revered not only as a general, but also as a visionary who had connected the world, fused cultures, and set a global standard for conquest and domination. The immediate consequences of his death were chaos, intrigue, and wars among the generals. But in the long term, his actions led to a profound transformation of the world. The Hellenistic Age began, an epoch in which Greek culture, science, administration, and military organization became active in the Near East, Egypt, Central Asia, and India. Alexander had laid the foundation for a world that was more culturally and politically interconnected than ever before. His death in Babylon marked the end of the era of direct conquest, but not the end of his influence. Alexander's vision, ambition, military brilliance, and political genius had created not only an empire that encompassed all the known countries of Asia, but also a cultural, economic, and strategic influence that lasted far beyond his lifetime. The world as it emerged afterwards bore his unmistakable signature in cities, streets, administration, armies, and the idea that a person can shape the world if courage, intelligence, and vision work together.
Chapter 20. The Legacy of Alexander the Great, Hellenism, Culture, and Influence on Posterity. Alexander the Great left behind not only a huge, politically fragmented empire, but also a cultural legacy that left a lasting mark on the world. The Hellenistic cities he founded, the trade routes he secured, and the administrative systems he instituted had an effect far beyond his death. Under the rule of his successors, the Diadochi, Greek culture, language, and science spread across the Near East, Egypt, and Central Asia, creating the so-called Hellenistic Age, which laid the basis for cultural and scientific developments over centuries. Alexander had understood that military conquest alone was not enough to secure power in the long term. The integration of the conquered peoples, the marriage policy between Macedonian officers and local families, and the promotion of local elites created a network of loyalty and cooperation. Cities such as Alexandria in Egypt, Alexandria Eshate in Sogdia, or the numerous garrison cities in Bactria and Persia became not only military bases, but centers of cultural and economic networking. They combined Greek and local traditions and enabled an exchange of ideas, technologies, and art that changed the region forever. Hellenism, as initiated by Alexander, was more than just the spread of the Greek language and culture. It was a means of political stabilization, a tool of administration, and a symbol of his vision of a united empire. The fusion of cultures promoted trade, science, and philosophy. Libraries were established, schools were founded, and Greek education took hold in far-flung regions. Alexandria in Egypt became the center of scientific research, astronomy, mathematics, and philosophy, and remained a beacon of knowledge for centuries. Militarily, Alexander left a legacy that has been studied by generations of generals. His combination of phalanx, cavalry, siege engines, and fast marching movements was revolutionary. Commanders such as Hannibal, Caesar, Charlemagne, and Napoleon studied his strategies and tactics, learning from his battles at Granicos, Issos, Gaugamela, and Hydaspes. Alexander proved that leadership, courage, and strategic thinking can decide the outcome even in seemingly hopeless situations. His political legacy was just as enduring. The way he involved local rulers, forged political alliances, and reorganized the administration laid the foundations for stable rule over multi-ethnic empires. The Diadochi adopted these principles and built kingdoms on them, some of which lasted for centuries. In Egypt, for example, Ptolemy established a dynastic system based on Alexander's integration policy and administrative principles. But Alexander's influence extended far beyond concrete political structures. His image as an invincible general, charismatic leader, and visionary ruler became legendary. Even during his lifetime, many revered him as an almost divine figure. And after his death, he became a symbol of courage, vision, and the ability to achieve the impossible. His life inspired not only military strategists, but also philosophers, poets, and rulers in the centuries that followed. Alexander's legacy is also evident in the geographical and economic interconnectedness of the world. The cities he founded were located on trade routes that connected Greeks, Persians, Indians, Egyptians, and other peoples. Goods, technologies, and ideas could be exchanged over thousands of kilometers. Alexander thus created an early form of globalization that accelerated cultural and economic exchange and connected regions that had previously been largely isolated. His influence on posterity was extensive: military, political, cultural, and economic. He showed that a person can change the world through vision, courage, strategic thinking, and diplomatic skills. Alexander's conquests led to a networking of cultures that was still noticeable centuries after his death. Hellenism shaped art, science, religion, and administration in the Near East, Central Asia, Egypt, and Greece. His name became synonymous with indomitable ambition, visionary action, and the ability to shape the world on a scale that was previously unknown. Even though his empire disintegrated into several kingdoms after his death, and the unity that Alexander had created did not exist, the legacy of his actions remained. The cities he founded, the cultural fusion, the administrative structures, and the military innovations continue to have an effect for generations. Alexander had not only conquered a world empire, but also initiated a new order of the world that endured beyond cultural, political, and geographical borders. Alexander the Great died young, exhausted, and perhaps physically broken, but his spirit, vision, and influence lived on. His legacy was not only the land he had conquered, but the idea of a united empire, the fusion of cultures, and the idea that a person can shape the world through courage, intelligence, and vision. In this dimension, Alexander survived death and left humanity a legacy that had an impact far beyond his lifetime, and laid the foundation for the Hellenistic Age, an age that permanently changed world history.